It is one of the most iconic photos in American history. A woman in ragged clothing holding a baby as two more children huddle close by, hiding their faces. The mother squints into the distance, one hand lifted to her mouth and anxiety etched deep into the lines of her face. From the moment it first appeared in a San Francisco newspaper in March of 1936, the image known as Migrant Mother came to symbolize the hunger, poverty, and helplessness of those caught in the crossfire of the Great Depression. The photographer was Dorothea Lange, who had traveled to a camp of migrant farm workers in Nipano, California, as part of the governor's resettlement administration. For the people that she documented, there was no going home, and there was no home to go to. The migrant woman, Florence Owens Thompson, was a full-blooded Native American, a widow, reduced to picking cotton to support her 6 children. By her own account, she just existed, picking 450 to 500 pounds of cotton a day. Like so many during the Dust Bowl years, she did her best with what little she had, but she could not turn back the clock and go home again to a husband or to a life that were now gone with the wind. At some point in our lives, we all leave home. In the process, we become homeless and leave behind the life that was. Sometimes this is born of free choice, and sometimes, like in the case of the migrant woman, leaving home is more than just a physical or geographical challenge. It is also a spiritual challenge. It is a situation that all too often is forced upon us. It is a movement deep within our soul that calls us to leave the past behind and to enter the wilderness of temptation where we struggle. In the midst of this struggle, when faced with uncertainty, we often wish that we could go home, go back to the way that things were, back to the flesh pots of Egypt, as the people of the Exodus cried when they were faced with the hunger and thirst in the wilderness of the Sinai. The great classics from the stories of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, involving the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, were all stories about leaving home. And so were the stories about Moses and David, Jesus and Peter, Paul, and disciples and the apostles. Each of them had to face leaving the way things were to discover the way that things could be. The big promise that God made to his people was to bring them home to a new land, the promised land. But it wasn't just the land that the people of the Exodus and the exiles in Babylon were promised, but a new beginning with a renewed relationship with the Lord of life. A renewed relationship that promised spiritual wholeness, healing, and peace. But this newness doesn't come without a struggle. And that is what the story of the encounter at the river Jabbok in Genesis tells us. Patriarch Joseph was a young man with a wrapped sheet about as long as the Himalayas are high. He ran away from home after manipulating to get his older brother Esau's inheritance and stealing his blessing. Esau vowed revenge. Then Jacob ran totally unprepared into the wilderness and into an older version of himself and his uncle Laban, who finagled the young man into working for him for 14 long years to get the hand of the woman of his dreams, Rachel. But first he had to marry her older sister Leah first. There was, though, another wilderness facing Jacob, because he just wasn't growing up, and his past followed him no matter where he went. And that past came home to roost along the banks of the river Jabbok. Each of us, I think, is destined to find ourselves there, wanting to ford the stream into the future, but something is in our way, something that needs to be resolved, something that is holding us back. We cannot peacefully find a new home until we deal with the residue of the past, the home that we left behind. And so Jacob sent his wives and servants and his sons across the river, and he stayed behind, attempting to bribe the 400 men of Esau's contingent who stood waiting across the ford. He did not know for sure what the mindset was of his brother Esau, but he knew full well what he had done to his brother years before, and that was enough to keep him up at night. When the bribes failed, Jacob was stuck with Esau in front of him and his past behind him. He was alone. It was dark. This time his conniving and scheming and deceptions could not save him. The river Jabbok was for him more than just a river, a body of water. It was a solitary place of struggle and of wrestling. And as the writer of Genesis 32 tells us, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Genesis 32:24. But who was that man? Was it God? Was it Esau? Was it Jacob's uncle Laban? Was it Isaac his father? Was it Jacob himself? Was he wrestling with his past, his future, his identity, his faith? The answer to all of the above has to be yes. But the writer of Genesis 32 wants us to see that Jacob was actually wrestling with God, face to face. In that nighttime wrestling match, Jacob was both wounded and he was blessed. And those two always seem to be together. His past wounded him, but there's more to this story. Genesis 32 also tells us that Jacob refused to let his adversary go. Oh, really? How about looking at this story from another perspective, from the perspective of the adversary? How about considering that the adversary, God, refused to let Jacob go? He refused to let him go until Jacob changed. And that could only be when God took the initiative to bless him and then to wound him. Jacob was never, ever in the position to win that match. He was in that position because God wanted something from him. He wanted him to grow up so that he could be the patriarch of his people, so that he could be the one through whom all the families of the world would find blessing. But that blessing comes only through struggle, and at the end of which comes the break of day. After that struggle, the writer of Genesis tells us that Jacob was given a new name, Israel. Finally, it seemed that his past was behind him. And in front of him, much to his utter surprise, was an accepting and forgiving brother who had long before let go of the anger and vengeance that once weighed him down. What is interesting to me is that once Jacob's relationship with God was mended, his relationship with his brother was resolved. We all have our encounters at the river Jabbok. It may be in the form of an addiction, or dealing with grief and with loss, or trying to deal with a broken relationship or friendship. We all have to struggle with our past at one point or another in our lives. But be assured that if God is the one you are wrestling with, he is not going to let you go either, because he wants you to be one through whom all the blessings of the world flow into it. So hang in there. A new day is coming, and there is blessing for you at the end of the tunnel. Maybe, in a way, it is good that we can never go home again, especially when we learn that the home that God intends for us here is so much better and so much more animated with life and with light. Thanks be to God, and amen.